Welcome, friends and comrades, to another interview segment hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Tonight we'll be talking with Camila Escalante about the emerging multipolar world order and its connection to the struggles against imperialism in Central America, specifically those in Honduras and Nicaragua. Camila is the co-founder and editor of Kawsachun News. She co-hosts the English language podcast on Kawsachun News entitled Latin America Review and is the Latin American correspondent for Press TV. So without further ado, we'll get started right after this. Hey, comrade, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you guys.
Likewise. We usually like to start with a little bit of a autobiographical question. So can you please let us know what your story is? How did you come to the socialist left, and how did you come to become a journalist?
All right. Well, my family was involved as guerrilla combatants in the FMLN guerrilla in El Salvador. Both sides of my family are from El Salvador. And I'm sure a lot of your audience knows what took place there. But there was a conflict lasting through the 80s. And in the end, there was peace accords in 1992. But the FMLN was an organization made up of principally five organizations of communists, of Marxist-Leninist organizations that fought against a right-wing dictatorship and CIA-trained and backed repression. And so my family has roots in that struggle. And I grew up in North America, but I've always wanted to live in Central America. I've always wanted to move back to El Salvador. And, at some point began making the connections between, the repression and dictatorship and the killings and the massacres and everything that took place in our country and the different uprisings and struggles that took place in other countries, such as South America, obviously Cuba, Nicaragua. And so I've been following these things, I think, for a while, I would say. Of course, introduced to me by my parents and my family. So I don't really feel like I came to this suddenly. I think it's more of just the trajectory that I was raised by. And I've done a lot of Latin America solidarity work. And eventually that just turned into journalism. And a lot of people know me from my work at Telesur English, where I worked for several years as a presenter, as an anchor, as a correspondent, as a producer, broadcast producer for the TV stuff. And I've reported on a lot of different important things to me, including on the coup that took place in Bolivia in 2019 And it was during that coup in 2020 that myself and my colleague Ollie decided to launch Kawsachun News, because we didn't think we had enough of a platform or spaces that would really give more time, or the necessary time, to elaborate on what was taking place day by day, week by week there in Bolivia during the struggle led by the unions, the campesinos, the indigenous people, against the fascist coup that was, of course, supported by the US, supported by Canada and the West, and was highly unpopular. And so that was kind of a big reason why we started Kawsachun News. But we always had it in mind before that. We wanted to start some sort of outlet that was anti-imperialist, where we could kind of focus on putting out materials like you guys do on social media, online, not using conventional TV and radio, which I love. I love television and radio. And a lot of people in Latin America still watch television. They still get their news from TV and radio. But of course, our audience, which is the English speaking audience, whether it be in North America or in Africa or in Asia, or in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean where English is spoken, are increasingly, of course, getting their information from, these new platforms. And so we decided to really go for that, to spread the word about what was going on in Bolivia. But since then, as you've seen, we've covered a number of other things, including Nicaragua, including Lula's return to power, supported by the social movements of Brazil, and a lot of other really important issues. Right now, I'm in Nicaragua. I'm in Ciudad Sandino, which is right outside of Managua, the capital. And I've been spending a lot of time with friends in rural areas. And so I've been a little bit off the grid. So you might have seen that our output hasn't been as frequent as it may have been in the past, but we have a lot of really important things happening in our region, election-wise, and other processes that we'll be following quite closely in the coming months. But right now, my focus has been a little bit more, as you said, Carlos, on Honduras and Nicaragua.
That's very good to hear. I've heard the stereotype that with red diapered babies, which seems to be your background, it's very frequent that you get this dynamic where they kind of want to rebel from their parents, and they end up, going down the wrong routes. I know Noah almost had a phase or he did have a phase like that. Thankfully, he redirected himself towards the right positions. But it's good to hear you're carrying on the legacy of struggle that your family brought you into.
No, absolutely. I think it's very important to me because obviously there's something just very North American about me. I grew up in the US and Canada, and I've traveled around Europe and stuff, and I'll always have different opportunities. I'm not, I can't go around pretending to be super Salvadoran because I wasn't born in El Salvador. But, a lot of people in El Salvador or from El Salvador have been living in permanent exile. They have never felt that it was safe to return to the country. They've never been able to reestablish or reinsert themselves, and their opportunity to do so has closed. We had two governments of the FMLN. The last one was Salvador Sanchez Seren. And a lot of people felt that for the first time they could return to the country. And right now, the country is going through a very difficult and tricky time politically, and people continue to leave the country in really large numbers, regardless of what you think of this government led by Nayib Bukele. His government, with all of his promises and all of his discourse, hasn't slowed down outward migration. And it's pretty much, agreed upon by everyone that there is no opportunity for young people, and that people who are educated and who have any sort of opportunities to get residency or to get jobs on the exterior will do so. And a lot of people continue to leave on foot, and a lot of people don't feel safe returning to the country, and they are in permanent exile, like I said. And so me and I guess my siblings have felt very strongly that it is our country, and that we do want to live in Latin America. It's obviously we have the opportunity to live elsewhere, but why would we want to do that? We have a country. We are patriotic. We do want to take ownership of our histories, of our families, of everything that was taken from us, and return there and learn about, the struggle that our families came from, and keeping that sort of history alive, rather than kind of assuming this new identity of being a US person in Los Angeles going to Jamba Juice or whatever it is people do, and not to belittle, diaspora or whatever people want to call themselves, but it's not where we want to live. And we know that there are struggles here that we want to be a part of, and we want to see the development of our countries. We want to see the betterment, the improvement economically and otherwise of the lives of our people. And the situations here, we have been deliberately underdeveloped here in the global South and Latin America, and we're still fighting the legacy of hundreds of years of colonialism. And we don't want to just take off. We think that the fight is here, just like you guys think that it's so important to be there. In the United States, I think, for some of us, we feel like we want to be closer to the struggle and helping or accompanying the processes that are so important here, for example, in Central America, where I am. So that's why we want to be here. It is the case that a lot of people move to the United States and the global North and they become depoliticized, and they forget the reason why they're there. They forget why their families had to leave to begin with. And we never want to forget it. We want to keep that memory and history alive. Obviously, I'm no historian, maybe like some of you guys at the Institute, but I do think it's really important to talk about, why it is we had to leave, that there was such a strong campaign of anti-communism throughout our continent that was promoted and unleashed by the United States, by the CIA, for so many decades that made it impossible to have these ideologies, to have certain practices, and made people, force them to flee their countries and seek a new life in another place. And that happened to Chileans, that happened to Brazilians, to Argentines, to lots of different people who suffered persecution and whose families were massacred or experienced high degrees of violence. And we're still feeling the effects of that today.
Eddie, if you don't have anything to say, that's so wonderfully said. And we have a lot of contradictions in the struggle of labor against capital here in the global North and in the belly of the beast. And one of them is how the conservative wing of empire uses immigration to divide parts of the working class, and it's so important always to remind people that no one wants to leave their home. People are, as you said, forced out, forced to leave because of the conditions that are created. And who created those? Who created those conditions? It's a mixture of the legacy of colonialism and the contemporary legacy and ongoing legacy of U.S. imperialism and anti-communist, terroristic, fascistic governments that are propped up all over Latin America. And right on there. Yeah.
For sure. So to move on to our next question here, our first impersonal question, I guess. Recently, there were Democratic Socialists elected in Honduras and Colombia with Gustavo Petro and Xiomara Castro. And these are two traditionally right-wing countries that have served as bases of U.S. power in Latin and Central America. Honduras often being used as a jumping-off point for regime change efforts against Nicaragua, and then Colombia being used in the same way against Venezuela. So I guess in Honduras specifically, since Xiomara Castro's election, has anything substantial changed in Honduras? And is the U.S. stranglehold on the country being weakened?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And this is what I'm really fascinated in. And this is what I want to spend time in the coming months trying to answer. There's a really fascinating process taking place right now in Honduras with Xiomara Castro, who has been now in power for a year and a half. And things can't possibly change overnight. I think it's very important to say that people are really kind of this anti-imperialist audience that I have and that you guys have are really addicted to this like climax of everyone being super like hardcore anti-US, anti-imperialist, shutting down US bases, throwing out the gringos. And it doesn't happen that way. In fact, we have to like go back a little bit and talk about what the context is in Honduras. It's been a military enclave for over 100 years. And in July, Laura Richardson, the commander, General Laura Richardson of Southcom, she made a stop, she made a visit to Honduras. And it should be seen as an act of coercion, an act of intimidation, a way in which she and Washington can intimidate the government of Honduras as it's trying to enact new laws, as it's trying to contest the United States and negotiate some changes with the United States. Xiomara Castro has had a very strong discourse in international forum against U.S. involvement, in the coup that took place in Honduras. And they want to make a lot of changes. And the United States knows that. And that's why they're following them step by step all the time right now. And so we are, seeing the continued relationship between Honduras and the United States. They have to stay amicable on some level, but that doesn't mean that it's some sort of backdoor relationship, that Xiomara Castro isn't really anti-imperialist, that she's not really looking for profound change. She, in fact, is. But there's still so many military treaties between the two countries that are existing. There's still a trade relationship, and Honduras is still dependent on the United States. And the way out of that, one of the ways out of that, or a large part of that, was the opening of relations with China, which just took place a few months ago. And they're full speed ahead with that relationship. And that's one way in which a country that has been so reliant on U.S. funding, on the U.S. basically running their country, that they can start to begin to move away from that and seek other ways of financing development. And so these are, so there are military agreements that are being broken right now between Honduras and the United States, or at least they're being renegotiated. And the U.S. wants to negotiate so that these military pacts can stay in place. But Honduras didn't have access to its own territory for the use of military aircraft, and that is now changing. Literally, the United States has been able to utilize Honduras, as you kind of suggested in the question, as a base, but having permissions that even Honduras didn't even have militarily to utilize in its own territory. In Venezuela, it took a couple of years after Chavismo took power for them to kick out the gringos. It didn't happen overnight. So certainly it's not going to happen overnight in Honduras. And so this is the country, if you ask Hondurans themselves who are supporters of the government, or if you ask the government, they'll say that this is the number one country in our continent that has been occupied by the United States, has been utilized by the United States. For its geostrategic position, because of its mining, because of its natural resources. And you could also say something similar about Colombia as well. So it can be very difficult to just implement a completely new agenda. If you guys know about the Pomarola, help me, Carlos, if you know what it's called, but the military base, it actually is home to 1,500 US soldiers. I mean, this is massive. So there's a whole load of other military bases in Honduras as well, and around Central America, in part, used to, coerce the countries around, to try to strike fear in Nicaragua, and to make sure that they have control top to bottom of the American continent. So what can we expect from the Honduran government? They came to power through electoral means, through elections, peacefully. They, after 13 years of a coup, of dictatorship, is what they refer to it as, people in the streets resisting, being politically persecuted, people were imprisoned, young people were imprisoned, who opposed the coup. They finally made their way to the presidency through elections, not through guerrilla warfare, not through a military coup. So they actually don't have the force to just declare war right now on the US military and force them out overnight. So I think people, we really need to keep in mind that these things sort of take time, that the United States is the most powerful country economically, militarily in the world, and that Honduras is in the process. And some might argue that Mexico, Colombia, Brazil are countries that are kind of in the process of trying to change their relationship with the United States, but that it can't happen overnight. Right now, Honduras is in a war. This is what, the people tell me they're in a war. There are killings, there are terrorist acts, and this is all because, and the media onslaught, of course, all because they're boycotting the U.S., all because they're challenging the U.S.'s hegemony in their own country. And so Laura Richardson comes to intimidate, and she knows exactly what Xiomara is doing, what she's cooking up. She's trying to essentially phase out the United States and its role that it has historically had in the country. But the president didn't actually receive, Xiomara Castro didn't actually receive Laura Richardson when she was there. The military received her, and she didn't come with she didn't receive a huge reception from the state. So it just shows you that it's not as important as maybe, this sort of a visit would have been under Juan Orlando. Cuba has had 60 years of revolution, and it still continues to have Guantanamo, a U.S. military base on its territory. So that just comes to show how difficult the situation is. But I want to tell you guys a little bit about, I'm reading this book right now. I haven't gotten through it, but I do think it's really, I think it's really important because I was in Honduras on June 28th for a social movement congress, and it was June 28th was the anniversary, I guess the 14-year anniversary of the coup against Mel Zelaya, and we received a book that was written by Mel Zelaya on the coup, and it's really fascinating because it happened so long ago, and some of us were kind of younger at the time, so we don't really remember all of the details. A lot of people here in Nicaragua remember the details, and they followed things very closely because Nicaragua and the Sandinistas were very key to trying to help people whose lives were in danger at the time, including Mel Zelaya himself. But what happened there was, on the day of the coup at dawn, Mel Zelaya in this book, he recounts how there was involvement of the State Department, of Hillary Clinton, of Southcom in the coup. 200 military soldiers surrounded the presidential house. They took out the presidential guards. Masked military men pointed guns at their heads. They came in using high caliber assault weapons. They would have killed him. On that occasion and many other occasions, they falsified his resignation letter. These are all things that Xiomara is and her cabinet and people around her, those who advise her, including Manuel Zelaya himself, are reminding her the way in which they came in with such a force to take him out. Why did they take him out? Well, for one at that point in 2009, they were already trying to, liberate themselves of the Yankees. They were turning towards Venezuela, and it was the time of the pink wave. So Manuel Zelaya was trying to look towards Venezuela, towards Cuba, towards the Sandinistas, the FMLN in El Salvador, and also Lula in Brazil, and look for, ways of integrating with the region. This was kind of the prior wave of around the time of, the ALBA countries coming together and all of that. And they were beginning to import oil from Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. And so that, that relationship was frowned upon by the United States. And that's why they came in and said, we can't have that. And so, they couped him, and they made life very difficult for anyone trying to bring back democracy for 12 and a half, 13 years there. So this is what Xiomara has in the back of her head. This is why she is, slowly and cautiously trying to open and engage with China, trying to, take control of national sovereignty, make sure that, they're able to implement somewhat of a progressive social agenda, and change the country. But it takes a lot of time, and they're doing it under a great deal of coercion.
That's wonderfully said, comrade. And the way that we usually formulate that is that the part of the left, specifically in the West, that rejects these countries because, from day one, they don't have the perfect socialism that exists in their head, is that they have a purity fetish, right? And if things aren't purely how they exist in the realm of the ideas in their head, they reject them and condemn them. And even a process like the one that Cuba had 60 some years ago now, where they were able to basically expel the Yankees fairly quickly. That's not something I think can take root, at least right now, or it's not in the horizon for taking root in Latin America currently. And what we've seen is a different process that's been led by the 21st century socialism and countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, where it's a more procedural in character, and there's less like very strong and far leaps that are made in these transitions. But
Yeah. Next question's mine too. One of the, I mean, and it kind of goes along with what some of the things that were mentioned in your answer to the last question, having to do with U.S. imperialism in Latin and Central America. But one of the things that we found most inspirational about the revolutions in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela is that they're happening right under the nose of the U.S. empire, which obviously infuriates policymakers in Washington and transnational investors on Wall Street. So are there unique challenges for these countries that come with being situated in the Western Hemisphere right under the nose of the leading capitalist imperialist hegemon that is the U.S.? By example, the giant military presence that the U.S. keeps in the Caribbean. Yeah, kind of a tough question, but.
Yeah, you're asking very large questions, but it is extra difficult because the United States is situated all around both sides of our continent, all across the Atlantic and the Pacific, and with huge presence around the Caribbean. CARICOM began saying once again after after CELAC declared our region to be a zone of peace in 2014, when all of this intimidation was happening and they were trying to install Guaido in Venezuela and all of that. I think a lot of governments began seeing once again that the United States is making moves. They're trying to position themselves all around Venezuela and Colombia to be able to attack Venezuela from the Caribbean, from Colombia, and they began rejecting that. They said, we can't, we don't want any war in our region or any hostilities. But they actually haven't really rejected, I think, in any profound way, the presence of the United States, and the United States being, of course, the most important force within NATO. So this is NATO presence on our continent. It does need to be completely rejected. And that's why this campaign is so important that Black Alliance for Peace has actually initiated. And they've initiated with lots of partner organizations from the United States, but also from other countries. And they've reached out to a lot of different organizations around the continent to try to, outside of CELAC and outside of these institutions and beyond the governments, but on a social movement level from the people, and try to promote our region as a zone of peace and what that actually means. What that actually means is that, how can we exercise sovereignty from our countries when we're just faced by intimidation on all sides? Right now, as you guys know, Nicaragua is looking for different alternatives, not only because it's a country that is targeted in sanctions, and a lot of new sanctions are going to be coming out, pinned against Nicaragua in the coming months that are being promoted by Marco Rubio and other lawmakers. But these are all they're going to actually come to pass because they're going to receive bipartisan support in the United States. But also there is a need, because of the failures of the Panama Canal, for there to be another alternative, and that would be an interoceanic canal built in Nicaragua. This is something that Nicaragua has looked at with China, but wouldn't have the resources on its own to be able to build. So we don't know where this project is right now, but this is actually the worst possible scenario for the United States. The United States wants to be able to have control of all of the waterways, to all of the trade routes, and everything. And so that's why Panama is such a strategically important country for them, because it's just another occupied territory that they're able to largely control. And so it would just be disastrous for a country like Nicaragua, which is liberated territory, to be able to have to be able to build a canal in which countries of our continent could receive products from overseas, and increased South-South cooperation, and be able to export overseas. These are not, in this region, we're not gas producing or oil producing countries. We still need to import these things, and we have lots of difficulties with this as it is, even without conflicts overseas, even without COVID, even without new sanctions being imposed all of the time. And so the United States right now is using, its occupied territory countries, its launch pads, which are Costa Rica, Panama, traditionally Honduras, and other countries. It's continuing to cooperate with the government of El Salvador, with Jamaica, obviously Haiti. And so it does come with a lot of challenges. And, it's the same goes for Brazil. Brazil's trying to pursue its own sovereign path. Its model looks very different from what we've seen in Venezuela or Nicaragua. Obviously, it's not the same, but it's such an important economy for a region, such a large economy. And they want to have, just like Nicaragua, strengthened relationships with Iran, with Russia, and with China. And they want to have, they're asserting their right to trade with those countries, and they don't see the sanctions that are being imposed on those countries as valid. They don't see them as applicable to themselves. Brazil doesn't feel like it would, first of all, that those are just sanctions, but they also don't see why they would be applied, in any secondary way to them. And so, it is very challenging because of the location. The U.S. obviously continues to believe that our entire continent is its backyard. And I think that's why it's so important to kind of have these movements from below continue to push these supposedly anti-imperialist or these supposedly progressive governments, because we have seen them falter in recent years. Specifically, CARICOM, I think, has really disappointed with the way in which it's so quickly invited in Zelensky to speak at its summit, Justin Trudeau to come and try to get them on board with the war on Russia and everything else. CARICOM has also not been very friendly or supportive of Nicaragua under sanctions. And so it's very important that these sort of campaigns continue, because it puts these countries in a very tight spot. It makes it very difficult. Once the bases are set up all around our continent, how do we kick out the troops? How do we kick out U.S. presence? At the same time, these, Colombia and actually Argentina are supposed to be non-NATO allies. So they're supposed to be countries that have a certain relationship with NATO and specifically the United States, and are supposed to receive more funding, more access to training and arms and everything else. And you see the United States and European leaders coming down to South America, as we have in recent months, asking for weapons, asking for ammunition to send to Ukraine, and all sorts of other just ridiculousness. And they want to expand their war, their proxy war that's over in Europe, and bring it down here. And so far, we've been, I guess, fortunate that our countries have rejected it, that our governments have rejected that sort of expansion of bringing the war to our continent. But they continue to pursue the help of CARICOM, the help of Brazil and Colombia, to be able to attack Russia.
Very well said, comrade. And you were talking there about Brazil and it having its distinctive process of constructing an anti-imperialist, socialistic world order. And I remember this phrase from Lula, where he says something along the lines of, if Jesus comes back, he too would have to, make some concessions to the banker in order to the bankers in order to get ahead. And there's no copy and paste method for any of these struggles. Like, they each start from specific conditions that present difficulties for moving forward, and a lot of them try to move as much as they can move, and we shouldn't blame them for not being perfect or radical enough or whatever. But one of the most difficult things for a revolutionary process is to have a successful continuation after the original revolutionary generation either passes away or becomes like too old to rule properly. What I want to ask here is how are countries like Nicaragua, whose original revolutionary leaders are getting older, preparing the newer generations to carry on the legacy of decades past?
Well, Nicaragua is a country in which the people don't forget. They have a very strong memory of all of the different instances of U.S. intervention and U.S. onslaughts against their people. And so it's kind of just, it's taught in the schools, the different military invasions. And I guess because, there's no longer guerrilla warfare, there's no longer a war here. I guess maybe I can see from the outside how it would seem like maybe similar to other countries that sort of older generation of revolutionaries might be getting up there in age, but I don't feel like that's reflected here. I feel like there's constant renewal in the ranks of the Sandinista youth, of the younger generations, and they really remember what took place, in the history of their country before they were born, because people talk about it so often. They do a really good job of doing that, and that's contrasting with places like El Salvador, where so many people were forced into exile, and where so many people were afraid to speak about it anymore, where it became taboo. Actually, Nayib Bukele had has had this entire slogan of, stop talking about the past. It's not relevant anymore. You're talking about things that happened ages ago. Trying to kill our memory, and saying things like we need to look to the future, and that basically calling Arena, the right-wing party, and the FMLN dinosaurs. But really, of course, they're very much aligned with Arena, the new government of El Salvador. That's not new anymore, sorry, but the Nuevas Ideas government. And so here, people have really been able to talk about the heroes of the Sandinista revolution. If you listen to Daniel Ortega's speeches, he always does like a historical recap of this long period of struggle against U.S. imperialism, against the Monroe Doctrine. And I think it's very valuable. And he also puts it into current context and also talks about some current issues, such as NATO's war against Russia, such as he talks about, obviously, in the 19th, the celebration of the 19th, which is the triumph of the revolution, July 19th, which was celebrated for the 44th year this year. He talked about the historic links of solidarity with Burkina Faso, with Libya and Gaddafi, and with the peoples of Africa and governments of Africa. And that was really important. And so they sort of use the media, and they use the platform that is the presidency to speak on national television. This is still a country in which people turn on the TV to see a national televised address from the president, to educate people and to keep those ideas alive. At the same time, so many people in this country support the government. A lot of people are part of the Sandinista youth, and there are a lot of really important leaders who are in their 40s, 30s, who I think are prepared to lead the country if and when it becomes necessary. People who are ministers currently, or leaders of certain government institutions already, or mayors. There are many different people. And so I think that gives a particular advantage in this country. And of course, what took place here in 2018 is very much fresh in the minds of all Nicaraguans. months. Like every day it comes up in conversation, what took place here in 2018. I don't know if you guys have had the opportunity to speak about it, but beginning in mid-April of 2018, there was an attempted coup and destabilization attempt that was very extensively planned and which was financed by the United States through a lot of its agencies, largely the NED. And a lot of money was received here by coup leaders, and people were paid in order to carry out acts of violence and terrorism throughout the country for several weeks, actually almost 3 months, from April to about June, beginning of July of 2018. And it was using, some of the same color revolution tactics that we've seen elsewhere, particularly in Venezuela in 2014 and 2017. It was literally the same period of the year in which the same sort of thing happened in Venezuela in 2017, 1 year prior. But, people were here, the people who were engaged in the violence and the acts of terrorism, they were committing crimes at 300 roadblocks around the country at one point. There were, unidentified people in balaclavas. People were using mortars. They were shooting up into the air. This was taking place in cities and rural areas, and they were targeting, with their acts of violence, Sandinistas, or people they presumed to be Sandinistas or supporters of the government. And, they had the ultimate goal of overthrowing the Sandinista government. And that wasn't even a popular view at the time, but it had a lot of resources at the time. And the government, of course, has since prosecuted a lot of the coup leaders, a lot of the people who were involved in those acts of violence. They sent some people out of the countries. They stripped people of their citizenship for participating in the violence or for supporting it or for being the masterminds behind that. And they've also stripped people of citizenship and sent them away who were guilty of acts of treason beyond the acts of terrorism. They also, received financing. They didn't report it. They were essentially violating the equivalent of foreign agents laws here in the country. And so a lot of people here feel very strongly. They're very angry about what took place here, about the way in which they were attacked. There were a lot of killings, and most of them were people who are supportive of the Sandinista government or police officers or authorities. And so that's very fresh in their memories, and they say that they'll continue to protect their country, their process, the advances that are being made under the socialist government. And so, so I think that was, it wasn't, a war and a sort of confrontation as we've seen in the past here, but it had a profound impact on some of the younger generations who now know what it's like to be attacked having these sorts of tactics deployed in their country, and they vow to fight against any sort of intervention that tries to rear its head in the country once again. But I think because of the very smart decisions that were made by the government, it's very unlikely that any repeat of 2018 can happen again.
That's wonderful commentary right there. What's very sad is that there's a lot of prominent Marxist or socialist scholars in the U.S. who do a lot of work on Latin America, and so many of them fell for the portion of the old Sandinista intelligentsia that ended up aligning themselves with U.S.-backed coup plotters, and as you mentioned, there was an incredible amount of terrorist acts. And yeah, I could see that helping to educate a population and reinforce their hearts and minds and the connection of their being to the revolution. And that's something that these new processes in the 21st century socialism have been so successful in doing, like what Bolivia was able to do, coming back to power after a coup. I don't think that's ever been done in history. You're only able to do that when you have really won the war of hegemony and changed people's hearts and minds. And uh,
It kind of happened in 2002 in Venezuela, but
but
Yeah.
that's quicker. That was
quicker.
just
Yeah.
yeah. But again, it happened in Venezuela, and to a certain extent, it happened in Honduras as well, because it's only been around a decade that Manuel Zelaya was overthrown, and now the process has returned. So, what you mentioned about Bukele and killing of people's memory um, is so brutal. Because if you kill people's memory, you present an existential threat to the people themselves, right? Because anything that you can define as a people is always connected to that collective memory and how that collective memory will shapes the present and the aspirations for the future. And if you attack that, you're attacking the people themselves.
For sure. Yeah, and if people want to know more
Yeah,
about,
precise.
oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Eddie. I'm gonna grab my water. You talk for a minute. I'm gonna
Okay.
grab my water. One sec.
Cool. I was just gonna say, if anyone wants to know about Bukele or know more about him, that jackass, watch our Danny Shaw did a great video about him for our Midwestern Marks channel. Just goes over all of his lies or promises versus his actions, and yeah, the kind of candidate or kind of politician he is. But yeah, the next question has to do with a video that I watched about. I just searched Honduras on YouTube because I'm a glutton for punishment, I guess. I wanted to see what kind of propaganda had been cooked up by the empire. But there was a video from Reason TV claiming that Honduras is poor in certain measures like GDP, or they have low GDP, but they're rich in natural resources. And they say this is because of government instability and land expropriations in the past, where the socialist leaders tried to redistribute the land. And this is what's made Honduras poor. So would you say that's true, that it's the fault of the Honduran government? Or is it more accurate to say that imperialism and exploitation have prevented Honduras from investing their own natural resources in themselves and developing?
Well, it's just totally absurd. I think, I mean, the way in which like these governments are going to have to think about things is not going to be in terms of GDP necessarily. And of course, they are very keen on following the different indicators and making sure that the economy is improving and growing, and that they're able to export more and develop the country and its industries. But really, if these governments fancy themselves to be, humanistic, pro people, human centering governments, and they're going to look at how the individual and how families, that's how they frame it, especially in Nicaragua. They look at the family, how the family is faring under the different circumstances. And so, the way in which governments like the MAS government in Bolivia has been able to pull so many people out of poverty and extreme poverty in such a short period of time was through giving land titles to small scale farmers, to specifically to cocaleros, the people who grow the coca leaf traditionally for traditional uses. And those people are obviously working within a framework where they're only able to produce so much legally, but they're also able to use their land, and they're urged to use their land for other things like producing other produce, other things that they can sell, so that they're not only reliant on growing the coca leaf. And you can see the same thing and how it's benefited families here in Nicaragua. These are still countries where a lot of people live in rural areas, and in which they largely are able to feed their populations through domestic production, which means that countries like Bolivia and Nicaragua are able to despite any world events that take place, any of the difficulties that may come as a result of any sanctions that are imposed, they're able to feed their populations because they have a high degree of food sovereignty. In Nicaragua, it's over 90% food sovereign. Next door, El Salvador and Honduras, they have to import all of their food. It's a really terrible situation, and the terrain is the same, the land is largely the same, but they've just done a better job here of distributing land and encouraging these sorts of production methods. I think I lost track of what your question was, Eddie, but or maybe you can jump on and tell me what you want me to go for next.
That's all right. I mean, I can move on to the next part of the question too. It was really in response to this ridiculous propaganda video I watched by Reason TV. And they were trying to say that Honduras's GDP isn't as high because of, their own government, not because of imperialism or external forces or puppet governments installed. But I think everyone in our audience is hopefully aware that, exploitation plays a huge role and imperialism plays a huge role in holding countries in poverty. But I did want to ask, and maybe you don't know anything about this, that's fine. But in that video, it also mentioned that a bunch of foreign private investors are trying to create what they call an anarcho-capitalist utopia in Honduras. It's called Prospera. They're basically just walling off the zone of investment to try and isolate themselves from the government. Is what it seemed like. Do you know anything about that? Is it just rich people protecting their wealth, or have you not heard about that yet?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about that specifically, but under Juan Orlando, the previous government, they passed the ZEDES laws to make these different areas, create these different areas in which foreign investors could come, like buy up an island or a piece of Honduran land and make it their own, essentially giving away, pieces of Honduran land to foreigners, and they could pretty much do whatever they wanted on that land. And that's something that the president, Xiomara Castro, in her inauguration speech said that she was resolutely going to do away with, and they're in the process of revoking that law in order to ensure that they have complete control of their national territory, the way Nicaragua has control of its national territory. There's a lot of problems with the lack of democratization of land in a country like Honduras. But one of the things that that a comrade impressed upon me here in Nicaragua is how these coups are, they're multifaceted. There's a lot of different reasons why, you would have a coup. One of the reasons is just in general, because you want, certain political sectors of the country, the opposition, want to be able to take control of the natural resources and just sell them off to corporations, to sell off the rights of the country and completely deplete the country of its natural resources and its control of all of its wealth, and give it away. But there are many other reasons, and there are many other effects. And one of them is that that when these coups take place, with the involvement of the United States and all of the embassies and everything else, they're actually opening up the country to the drug trade further than it has been. When these countries have, sort of a vacuum of power, when these right-wing coups take over, or these right-wing governments are installed, they no longer control the national borders. And this even was part of why 2018 happened here in Nicaragua. It wasn't a successful coup, but because there was a little bit of, insecurity, there was so much violence, these sorts of destabilizing forces invited some of the drug traffickers to use some of their traditional routes that they would have relied on in Nicaragua from the neoliberal period. And that's something that, they did in Honduras during that 12 years or whatever it was of the coup dictatorship. They allowed those transnational criminal organizations to take a hold of the country. And that's why they consider it now the Honduran people or the government to be a narco state. That's something that they're trying to undo right now. That was also the effect of the 2019 coup in Bolivia, that although it only lasted about 12 months before the people came back and brought the movement towards socialism back to power, that during the Janine Áñez coup, a lot of the borders became more porous than they had ever been, and they allowed, paramilitaries, they allowed all of these different groups to seize control of large areas of the borders, and allow for a lot of the drug trade that had been completely wiped out thanks to Evo and his government to return to the country. And so I believe that was in large part what they did during those 12 years of government in Honduras. And so I always come back to, and probably sound like a broken record, but the model that Nicaragua has employed has been so important and so successful in eradicating the sorts of criminal activity from its national territory. And as Evo says in Bolivia, the only way that you can take control of the drug trade and completely expulse any sort of or expel any of the cartels and stuff is by expelling the DEA and expelling the U.S. military presence and even political presence from the country, I would say, because we've seen, certainly as the case in Colombia and also Honduras, that their presence has only resulted in more crime, more violence, more destabilization, and they haven't really presented any positive results in their supposed war on crime that was largely designed by Joe Biden. And so, this is all the process that Honduras is going through right now. They're trying to find ways to democratize land ownership. And they have a vice minister right now who is Rafael Alegría, and he is one of the leaders, like in the world, but definitely in Central America, of La Via Campesina, this very important and large social movement that is the World Peasant Organization. And he actually has worked for years and years, both in Honduras with his organization, but also on a continental and international level, to try to promote these sorts of policies of land democratization, against the use of pesticides, trying to promote the use of agroecological methods in farming, and those sorts of things. So it's very, important that he was so quickly brought into the government. He's the vice minister of land reform or something like that. And so, so Xiomara has that on her plate as well, that she needs to implement that. And we know that once, campesinos are able to get access to land and be able to grow and contribute to the national economy in that way, that will also see, and as long as she they pursue, the sort of direction of getting the U.S. less involved with Honduras, I don't know, kicking the U.S. military and its bases out eventually, that, that the territory will be safer, that it'll be free from these cartels, and it'll cease to be a narco state, but also that it'll be able to control, things like contraband and all the other things that are going to be hurting the economy as well.
That's a great response. Thanks. I'm glad I asked that question about Prospera, or the sections of land that are being zoned off, because that's exactly what it is. What you described, like a section of land that was zoned off under the previous government, where private investors could come in and basically do whatever they wanted, including like almost make their own laws or rules. And someone in the chat says Prospera is a private island, like you had said, an area called Islas de la Bahia, or the Bay Islands. So very interesting stuff. And it is clear that the investors who plan to go to this place were very worried about the Castro government restricting their ability to to do whatever they wanted and have their own private capitalist playpen, I guess.
It's interesting that you mentioned the drug trade, and I've always found it kind of ironic that the American institution that's supposed to fight the drug trade, but actually proliferates it, and it's a big part in like why it exists. It's called the Drug Enforcement Agency. If they enforce the drugs.
Yeah.
But, we can hop
I think it
into.
must be like sometimes I feel like mentioning it, but then sometimes I just feel like everybody. I think it's almost common knowledge that the DEA is just the world's largest narco cartel. I mean, it just seems like it's so obvious that I think even in regardless of what we think about Gustavo Petro and what he does with his platform, he has gone to the UN and he has given some fiery speeches that people really love, in which he said that, this war on drugs hasn't resulted in anything positive for us in Colombia. We're not the ones producing fentanyl. We're the ones dying for this war on drugs. It's Colombians who are giving their lives so that people in the global north, but specifically in the US, can feed their addictions. And the United States hasn't done anything to deal with its demand side of things. So I think, those are very important words in terms of having the discourse. I would hope that it would translate into some concrete actions. I'm not sure, I haven't been following close enough to see if it has, but it's just pretty like, it's got to be just common knowledge that the United States can't be trusted for advising, consulting, or carrying out any sort of counter drug operations. And it's under that pretext that it's putting down all of its, military operations. It says it needs to send more submarines here, more submarines there, in order to interdict all these, all of these drug operations. But I mean, it really hasn't slowed the flow of drugs in any way. And so it's, I go back to how important and I think how brilliant this campaign that Black Alliance for Peace has had for a couple years now, I think, which is U.S. out of AFRICOM, or like the Africa Command, to leave the continent, to be expelled from the continent, because it's just bringing more war, more violence, more terrorism to the local populations, with absolutely no chance of ever having any positive result. It is just the continuation of its occupation policies, of its imperialist policies, of trying to spread its tentacles all over the global south. And so it's really good to have that conversation demanding that common demand, which is, from here, which is, Southcom off of the continent, no more US NATO bases. And the same goes for Africa and Asia.
Oh, sorry, I muted and unmuted myself. What's crazy is that you'll then get the pro-imperialist ideologues and the Latin American right-wingers who say, no, it's Bolivia that's a narco state because they're trading in the coca leaf, which then in turn is used as the justification for having the DEA there. Like, look, they're trading the coca leaf, when, anyone who looks at it knows that the coca leaf isn't even turned into cocaine generally in Latin America. It's exported and then it's used for whatever. And of course, the DEA is doing the opposite of actually fighting a war on drugs there. So things get all mixed up in the with the propaganda. And, you kind of have to explain about a mountain of history to help Americans untangle that propaganda in their minds. But, that's why an interview like what we're doing today is really helpful for all the comrades in the West. And we really appreciate you being with us and helping us explain some of these things.
And I remember that Petro speech in the UN, and part of what he does is also connect the commonality of the struggle of our people in the U.S., which are dying on the streets from drug overdoses that have been flooded into their neighborhoods by State Department agencies. And like you said, a lot of this stuff is like common knowledge for just regular Americans. They know that like the CIA used Contras to not only destabilize Central America and but also to destabilize the neighborhoods of specifically poor and working class Black people in the U.S., which were getting increasingly militant, and it's destroyed communities. And it's such a an easy place to see where the interests of like labor and poor and working class people in the U.S. aligns so much with the interests of other working people across the world, or specifically in Central and South America, that are fighting against imperialism. It's a common struggle, and whether it's Colombia or countries in Central America or Mexico, whatever it is, like we're all being affected by these actions that are taken really to only benefit a small group of people in the imperialist north, and then a small group of gusanos de corbata, as Martí used to call them, in the global south, who sell out the interest of their people for crumbs from the colonial loot. But you were one of the founders in 2019 of Kawsachun News, which has turned very quickly into one of our favorite sources of news on Bolivia, Latin America, and anti-imperialist news in general. Can you tell us a bit about Kawsachun News, its founding, and the necessity of having revolutionary and anti-imperialist outlets such as Kawsachun, Telesur, which you've also worked for, and others which are helping to counter imperialist lies and distortions?
Well, I kind of touched on it in the beginning. We just founded it a little bit rushed out of necessity. We just needed to create a platform where we could talk about what was going on in Bolivia at the time, with all of the repression, with the massacres that took place that first week that Janine Áñez swore herself in as president, and they began committing atrocities and jailing people arbitrarily, who stood up against the coup. But we are an outlet that we've always worked only on a voluntary basis. We've had to have other sources of funding. We're not professional anti-imperialists, unfortunately. We're not receiving big sums of money from large donors. We never have. I do think that because that sort of thing has opened up in the United States and in the global north, where there are a lot of people who are sort of like activist influencers, who have some sort of backing because of some whatever it is, a social movement, or not social movement, an organization or nonprofit or institute that they're a part of that is able to pay them to do their work. Sometimes people might think that it's very easy for us to do what we do, but it's not. And for that reason, we juggle a lot of different jobs. But we think it's really important because, like as I was venting about a little earlier on Twitter, a lot of people, and this is only part of our audience. It's important to say that we do sort of coverage on Latin America in English, but that's not to say that it's just for the United States or anything. There's like a lot of the world actually speaks English, and it allows us to communicate better with comrades in Africa and Asia as well. But, in the United States, which is a large part of our audience, and definitely the people who subscribe to our Patreon, there are a lot of people who believe that because they're surrounded by all of these different polarized views, and because of the way in which the discourse goes in the United States, a lot of which I'm not very aware of all the time, but people believe that everything is either whatever they think it is, like MAGA, or they think it's like the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders stuff, and there's just two sides to everything and nothing else. And we think it's very important. One of the reasons we founded Kawsachun News is just to show that there are a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different alternatives to capitalism, a lot of different alternatives to the culture that exists in the United States, a lot of different approaches to development, to socialism, that it's not all going to look the same. Because we have so few resources, sometimes we don't have a lot of output. But even just the difference between, the Bolivarian Revolution and the Sandinista Revolution, it's like there's huge differences sometimes, and we think it's very important to show the different range of perspectives that exist. And a year and a half ago, when the Russian special military operation was beginning, I thought it was really important to use Kawsachun News to show what the reactions were from Latin America, which in large part were very similar to what the reactions were to the special military operation in Africa, which is that a lot of people said that they were largely neutral, that they had nothing to do with the conflict, they had nothing to do with NATO, they have nothing to do with Ukraine, and that this war is taking place, is going to affect all of us with inflation, with issues with supply chain and everything else, but that we want to, focus on developing our countries, on recovering our economies after, years of COVID lockdowns and everything that took place, and that we don't want to get involved. But also a lot of people in Latin America, a lot of important leaders, movement leaders, and of course, political leaders like Evo Morales and like Nicolas Maduro, and of course, Daniel Ortega, made it very clear that they saw for years and years the root of the conflict that we're seeing now, which was, the NATO aspirations to expand and its encroachment on Russian borders. And it said that it didn't, these different people, Evo, for example, said that he didn't blame Russia for what it had to do. And I think that these are really important perspectives to share. They were all expressed in Spanish, and so that's largely what we do at Kawsachun News, is a lot of, finding these sorts of declarations made and trying to cut a good soundbite that people can try to understand what the viewpoints are, and just translating and subtitling them into English. But we wanted to show that not everybody is in support of sending, billions of dollars to Ukraine for weapons, of taking, all of the public's money and sending it to a war and warmongering. It's quite different from what's going on in countries like Canada. The United States is the most important country of NATO, and it's getting all of these much smaller economies and populations to put in hundreds of millions of dollars or more into Ukraine every month. It seems like every couple of weeks, for example, Ottawa is announcing more money to be sent to Ukraine in the form of aid, in the form of actual aircrafts, and in the form of just cash that's being sent to Zelensky, and weapons that are being handed out to probably armed groups all over the world, and entering all sorts of other conflicts that we don't even know about. And so I think that perspective is just one of many that we've been able to showcase, and how different it is from the sort of debates that we're seeing inside of the United States. Of course, there's some of those perspectives were also voiced in the United States, in the case of Ukraine, but on other issues as well. I think it's really important to show, that different countries have different ways of doing things, and that we not look at things, in such a narrow, limited way. And we also just don't want, everything to be so U.S. and global North centric. And so, that's part of what we've tried to do. Also, trying to, with our podcasts or interviews, is highlight some of the voices from Latin America, sometimes experts, sometimes just young people, sometimes people who experienced the coup in Nicaragua, things like that.
Wonderfully said, comrade. We'd like to transition, because we've been going at it now for about an hour and 12 minutes, and just like we sometimes run on Cuban time in terms of starting, and we start a little bit late, we promise an hour and we give you 3 or something. We're going to try to keep it as short as we can, but there's 3 super chats here that we'd like to get to. 3 questions that the audience wants to ask you. The first one was from a political idealist, and they say, what do we think about the prisons in El Salvador? So.
Well, I think it's like it's a complicated matter, because I don't want to have a super long answer here. But first of all, I think it's very important that when we're criticizing a country, that we need to be very measured with what we say against these different governments, because you don't necessarily always agree with the things they do, but we never want to invite further U.S. involvement. And some of the Democrats have actually been very critical of Nayib Bukele. A lot of liberals in the United States, and liberal publications, they have gone against Nayib Bukele. And I think it's very important that we don't have El Salvador be a completely failed state. We don't want more U.S. advising. We don't want more U.S. military bases. The U.S. is already the number one funder of the police there, and so it's already a very difficult and delicate situation. But I think it's really important that we always start by saying that it's very important that the country be able to choose its own sovereign path, regardless of what we think about Nayib Bukele. He's very popular in the country, and he came to power with a very popular mandate, despite that there were a lot of people who didn't vote. There were a lot of people who absolutely hate him, but that it's possible and probable that he'll run for another term in office and that he will win, and that we need to try to work between that, and be careful with that. Just anytime you're kind of like importing or copying the model of the United States, which is like mass incarceration, and certain tough on crime laws, it's very, we have to look at the way in which these things are being adopted and employed. And we don't need a country in which all of the opportunity that a young man has in the country is either to be like an Uber Eats driver or be in the security forces of the country. Those are the only good paying jobs or jobs that there are for a young person. Otherwise, you have to flee on foot northward. So that's kind of the situation we are in right now, is that in order to mass incarcerate all of these people, some of which, of course, are not necessarily guilty of the crimes they're accused of, and there is some degree of political persecution that's taking place and arbitrary arrests, that they've had to, they're having to hire en masse people to join the security forces of the country. I mean, that doesn't it's pretty obvious that that's not taking the country in the right direction. There's already lack of opportunity. And now we're saying the only thing there is to do is for you to come and lock up everyone in your communities. It's pretty obvious that model isn't going to work out. And then you're going to have, a repeat of what we've seen before, which is, this mass population of people who are armed. I mean, it's just the criminal organizations that were on the streets are now going to be the criminal organizations which are the police of the country, which is the case in the United States. The mafias are the state. The mafias are the police themselves. So that's kind of what's going to take place. I mean, I think we could go on and on about this theme. I hope I can learn about it a little bit more now that I'm here in Central America. That's part of my purpose of being here. But, we know that when the Sandinista revolution took place, they immediately after had to refound the police and the armed forces and every branch of the military one by one. And there are people who are literal experts in doing that because they were around 40 years ago when that took place. And they had to gut every one of these institutions and install new people and do new forms of training. And people here are they have very good attitudes towards the police and towards the armed forces. They think very highly of them, which is in stark contrast with what you see in the United States or any of the countries that try to emulate the US model. And so that's what we would aim for. And that's what I think we would hope to see in countries like El Salvador and Honduras in the future.
Very well said. And yeah, there's so many contradictions at play there. And anytime you deal with crime, not by going to the root and seeing, how is poverty and desperation leading people down these roads that no one wants to go down, right? If you're a 16-year-old kid who's looking at a futureless future, that's what leads you to maybe consider this. Like if you had everything else established and your necessaries of life met and a good prospect for the future, it wouldn't just pop into your head like, yeah, let me do crime. Like these are results of the system, and you don't solve them by just incarcerating a shitload of people as the U.S. has done. But it is also true, on the other hand, that poor and working class people that are not involved in that do not appreciate there being crime in their communities, right? So there's a lot of contradictions at play, and I think that's how a figure like Bukele ended up becoming popular with a good portion of the country that might not favor the way that's being done, but they do favor any decrease in crime that may take place, because those are things that just, they're difficult to live with. And we have rising crime rates now in the U.S., and it's extremely difficult for working class communities, and nothing near to an actual solution is ever going to be proposed by the bourgeoisie. They'll just incarcerate people and profit from it too, and promote more incarceration, because that means more profit. And there's this huge labor force within the prisons of people that make pennies on the dollar for every hour. And but we have another question here from Left is Best, who has asked two questions. But here's their first one. Did we ask her about our comrades' resistance to the coup leadership in Peru? As far as Peru, we had a really good interview a few days ago with Sebastian Leon, one of our contributors and a philosophy professor in Lima, Peru, who I think the interview was the day before the Independence Day, on the 28th, and he was telling us how the new wave of protests were going. But there's been a bunch of police repression, specifically on the Independence Day protests. But how's the sort of atmosphere where you're at, Camila, with regard to the situation in Peru? How are people seeing that unfold?
Well, like I said in the beginning, I think I've been a little bit off the grid, so I don't really, unfortunately, when these sorts of protests began in Peru on the 19th, I haven't actually been following, because I haven't had a ton of access to the internet or TV, but I think people are seeing it in the same way as they saw the coup in Bolivia, and they have been in full solidarity with the Peruvian people. And that's something that Daniel Ortega said in the very beginning when the coup unfolded on December 10th in Peru against Pedro Castillo. I attended this social movement congress in Tegucigalpa at the end of June. It was a congress of social movements from all around Central America. The largest countries that were represented were Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and then a little bit Mexico. There were other countries, but with smaller delegations, and I was there with a delegation from Nicaragua. And on many occasions, we did hear from some Peruvian comrades in person, but it was mentioned various times throughout the Congress that one of the most important demands of the Peruvian people is the release of Pedro Castillo. He is a political prisoner. He is the elected president. And it's very important for us to not forget that, because, many of us feel really strongly that it was very strategic and important that, that Evo, after the coup, had this whole idea of how everything was going to take place. He showed great leadership in, protecting his life, leaving the country, going to Mexico, then going to Buenos Aires, speaking with the bases or the representatives of the bases there in Buenos Aires, talking about how they were going to demand the elections and then put forth a candidate, make sure that they had that date. Obviously, those roadblocks were held and everything took place in order to make sure that the coup dictatorship did, in fact, organize the elections. And but despite that happened, and that the mass return to power through elections and through the popular vote, that right now is supposed to be the fourth term of Evo Morales, and that hasn't changed. Evo Morales should be the president of Bolivia today, and that's just categorical. Luis Arce was someone who was very close to him, and that was very instrumental during all these years in growing the Bolivian economy and developing the country and making very good informed decisions, with this overall strategy that the mass government had of how to take people, how to apply all of this poverty alleviation that they had in mind, with the help of different partners, through these great policies, and pursuing, heightened national production, exporting, all of these different things. That's great and all. But Evo Morales was elected, and for that reason, he's going to be running probably again in the future. In the case of Brazil in 2016, we saw the coup against Dilma Rousseff. unfold over several months, and Dilma was removed. And precisely when, and I'm not arguing with the people of Brazil, but precisely when Dilma was removed in this, like, parliamentary judicial coup, people began saying Lula presidente over and over and over again. They wanted Lula to be brought back to power. Of course, I support that because that's what the basis said. That's what the organization said. We're talking about millions and millions of people wanted Lula on that day to return to the presidency. But I believe that Dilma should have resumed power. She should have been put back into power. She won the popular vote on her own merits and is a very important leader in the country, in the country's history. And for that reason, now she's the president of the New Development Bank of the BRICS. But I don't think we should be so quick to allow these coups and these destabilization plots. We should not concede to them and not allow them to take the power away from us and the path that we were on. Inevitably, if in Peru they choose, through whatever means, the leftist parties there, Peru Libre, they go through a process internally, they choose a candidate. It could be very difficult. Their future elections could be inhibited or controlled by the US, by the OAS. They might not be fair elections, or they might just elect somebody who is not the leader that Pedro Castillo would have been. And that's not to say that Pedro Castillo is this like amazing leader. He's actually a very humble indigenous man from, I think from Cajamarca. And he, was not really prepared. He wasn't like of political stock, but he's who the people wanted to be at the head of the country, carrying out a certain agenda that he was elected on. And so I think that people do need to continue this campaign of calling for his release. He is being unjustly held. He is a hostage right now. And this government of Peru continues to be, controlled and advised by the U.S. Embassy there in Lima, which is a very important strategic embassy for the United States and for the OAS and its allies. And so that's a very important aspect of it, is that campaign to free Castillo, but also, I see like the fighting spirit of the indigenous people there. It to me just is exactly like what I saw and witnessed and reported on in Bolivia in 2019 with the massacres. We talk about like 2 or 3 different massacres in Bolivia. There have been at least like 4 in Peru. And so it is very, what has happened there has been very heavy. And so, I think people here are very much in support of the Peruvian people. It's very difficult to see what the way out of it is going to be, but it's certainly, as I saw in that social movement congress, is not off of people's radar, and people are following relatively closely, considering we're in another part of the continent.
It doesn't feel like you've been out of the game for some
time. I was
going
to say the same thing.
Yeah, that's right in line with the comments that were given to us by Sebastian, and it's so important that you emphasize like Castillo and the people wanting Castillo back, and because one of the things that he let us know that we weren't aware about was that both factions of the Peruvian like institutional party lefts, the communist parties and the alliances that they have with like the New Peru and the more cosmopolitan left, as well as the Peru Libre, like they kind of turned their backs on Castillo. And when they report on it for foreign news outlets or whatever, they add a bunch of demands that are being made by the people, but the main one, which is bring our fucking guy back, is usually not added. And I had read about a dozen news articles in preparation for that interview, and the vast majority of them from the West in English did not mention anything regarding bringing Castillo back, and that's like the main demand. The people see him as one of their own, and it's very sad that I think the more institutionalized left hasn't brought up that demand, but clearly you have and have done a very good job describing that. Thank you so much to Illinois State Fishing for giving us the $5 super chat. He says Kawsachun News with a bunch of fire emojis. Yes, it's a wonderful outlet, and we have shared it in the comment section a few times as well. Eddie, do you want to ask the second question from Left is Best?
Yeah, sure. He just says, and thank you so much for the super chat. Left is best. He says, I noticed Camila wearing a small hammer and sickle T-shirt a while back. Is she an open camarada?
Does
This
it mean
question
like,
might expose you as a tanky or something. I don't know.
I think he's just asking if you're
what was
a
that?
socialist.
A what?
A socialist, a socialist communist of sort. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've always considered myself and used the terminology of calling myself a communist, and that's nothing to shy away from. I think it's very common throughout Latin America, particularly in certain countries, and the use of the hammer sickle. And but I think, going back to how we started this conversation, there was a very strong anti-communist campaign throughout our continent for so many decades, and it was on that basis, and that so many people were killed. They were executed in the most gruesome of ways in Central America and South America during Operation Condor, and many other instances in which the CIA trained people to kill communists, to kill Marxists. And so it's not something that we should ever shy away from representing and from trying to implement those different ideals in our daily life. And I know that that's becoming more popular in the United States as well, whether it's, I don't know if it's along the same lines or if it's more of a fashion thing, but yes, I mean, definitely, like here in Nicaragua, for example, you see like a lot of the use of the symbolism of Sandinos, an important figure, just like Farabundo Martí, just like Francisco Morazan, are liberators, and leaders in different periods. But you also see people using other, communist symbols, I guess, and also paying tribute to the Soviet Union and stuff like that. And I think that's very important. Like, in these countries where under these revolutionary governments, where they have tried to bring back, the memory and make sure that everyone has an access to that sort of education of what took place here and the different fights against imperialism throughout their history. But they also, I think people are a little bit more they're a little bit more knowledgeable when it comes to some of the other revolutionary processes that have taken place, for example, in Africa and Asia. And that's thanks to, leaders like Daniel Ortega, who always brings it up in his speeches.
Wonderfully
That's
said,
awesome.
comrade. And we've taken about an hour and a half for your time, so we want to wrap up here. But just a future-oriented question. I think it's clear to everyone. You even see imperialist mouthpieces saying it. But we're emerging into, or are in already, a multipolar, or to use Chavez's term, pluripolar world. We've seen in the last few days very interesting and hopeful developments of Africa standing up. And this is something that is taking place in conjunction with the rise of China and the rise of Russia, and the embarrassment of the proxy war against Russia, just the complete obliteration of the NATO forces. Can you sort of point us to what role you see Latin America playing in this developing and emerging world order?
Well, whether it's countries that have been in firm opposition to U.S. imperialism and U.S. meddling and U.S. presence in their countries and on our continent, or countries that are actually still close to the United States, just across the board, countries are looking to other countries of the global South and other world powers. And they're saying that, the United States has not been able to deliver on its promises and has not produced anything positive for the development of their countries and their partnerships that they've historically held. the United States has been engaged in a lot of propagandizing here, a lot of going around in permanent campaign, trying to tell people what to do, how to live our lives. They've had these human rights campaigns that are ongoing. They're telling us how to do women's rights, how to do LGBT rights in ways that don't come from our people. These things all have to come from our people. All social progress, all social change, all, changing the configuration of our state and our culture and societies has to come from us if we want it. And they're trying to impose from the exterior, as they always have. And people have, outright rejected that. And people, these countries, these governments, one by one, have all, with the exception of a small handful, have open relations with China, and that's going to be very key in the future. And amid this special military operation and all of the propaganda against Russia, these countries continue to, they're actually expanding relations, trade relations, cooperation with Russia, despite all of the propaganda against Russia. And also the same for Iran, despite all of the sanctions and all the propaganda against Iran. And there's many other countries that you could add to that, Belarus, for example. And so, they're looking at ways, countries like Brazil, now under Lula, and Daniel Ortega here, they're looking at ways of strengthening these different relations, becoming less reliant on the United States, looking and being ready for any opportunity to adopt any sorts of other alternatives to the US dollar hegemony, and to be able to trade and to be able to circumvent the incoming sanctions that are going to further affect these economies. And so, their position has always been in favor of multipolarity. A lot of the countries of Latin America, their governments have been very clear on the fact that unipolarity has not benefited any of our economies, that the countries of Western Europe and North America have been able to reach a far greater degree of development at our expense, having exploited and continuing to exploit the workers of our countries, but also, the working class people in the global North. And so I think that, that's already, it's already happening, and everything that's taking place right now is just going to sort of accelerate the process of looking for alternatives to the really fucked up system that we're living in right now, the really fucked up modes of production and everything else. And so sometimes it's happening very quietly. Like Nicaragua, they're not going around announcing all of the different deals they're making, pacts they're making with other countries, because they just know that the priority is inward. Who's holding them accountable is the people of these countries. In the case of Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan people. They don't have to answer to any outside power. And so they're focusing on building the hospitals, building the schools with the better infrastructure, better capabilities to allow people to have a higher quality education and those sorts of things, and not allowing the U.S. tell us how we have to go about our development and our progress.
Beautifully said, comrade. Thank you so much. And thanks to Pinay Yonce for the 1979 super chat. 1979 for FSLN, baby. Thank you so much. And thank you also to Apolitical Idealist. Sorry we couldn't get to this. You should ask it in one of our following more laid-back streams, and we'll get to it definitely. But thank you so much, comrade, for coming on again. It's been such a pleasure and insightful conversation. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we go?
Well, I would just like to, I guess, plug Kawsachun News. We could always use new subscribers. We're really bad at promoting that, and we've been really quiet and haven't put out a lot in the last couple of months. But it's a really, I think, important perspective that we provide. And so we have a Patreon, and we welcome new subscribers. And apart from my journalism and my reporting, I also do I do some solidarity work with Nicaragua, and we have this newer coalition called the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, which you've probably, if you do follow me on Twitter, you might have seen me retweeting this new account of ours. But we have a website. It's a number of organizations, a lot of them in the United States, that have for a long time been doing solidarity work with Nicaragua. Some people in our coalition have been doing solidarity work since the 80s. So they've been around for a very long time. And we think it's really important to give a space to, these voices who are denouncing the imposition of new economic sanctions against Nicaragua, because those sanctions target the Nicaraguan people, never just individuals, government leaders or anything like that, but they cause really great damage. And like I mentioned earlier, senators in the United States are trying to push for more a new wave of sanctions right now, and it seems basically inevitable. And sometimes, within the U.S. Progressive voices, we hear a lot of condemnation of the blockade on Cuba. And also we've heard a lot more on Venezuela and the way in which the sanctions have affected the Venezuelan people and all of the hostility against Venezuela. And so I specifically have been dedicating a lot of my time to highlighting, the intervention and the meddling and the sort of a hybrid warfare on Nicaragua, because I don't think it gets enough of a platform in the English-speaking world, certainly not in North America. So I think our Twitter, because I know I don't know what your audience uses, but on Twitter, it's Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. It's Solidarity Nica. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's Solidarity Nica on Twitter, but then on Instagram, it's Nica Solidarity. So that's some of the stuff I do when I'm not reporting.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We'll have those posted once the video is fully done uploading. We'll have it pinned as the first comment.
Absolutely. And yeah, thanks for all the work that you've done. I know, in the process of making TikToks, I, go through a lot of sources. And when I'm talking about an issue and I see that you guys have reported on it, Kawsachun News, I jump on it right away. I'm like, thank goodness, there's good reporting out on this issue. Oftentimes, you guys are one of the only voices talking about certain issues in Latin America that I'm trying to report on. So it's been really useful, and I'll try and continue to boost your content to our TikTok audience, because it is absolutely invaluable.
Well,
thanks for
thank
that.
you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for coming on. If you could stay just a couple minutes after we end the live, that would be good. And thank you to all who watched. And we'll roll out with the International in the same way that we came in. So, see you all.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.